Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Baldrige Foundation's Institute for Performance Excellence webinar, using stakeholder feedback surveys to drive performance excellence. Before we get started today, I want to take a moment to recognize all of our great sponsors and a special thanks to the members of the Mac Baldrige Society who make up the trustees for the Institute for Performance Excellence. Today's guest is George Taylor, a good friend of ours who's been a supporter of the foundation for many years. He is the Chief Client Officer and Managing Partner of Beyond Feedback. Following George's presentation, I'm going to take some questions from the audience, and then we'll have a few closing remarks. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, George, to get us started.
Great, thank you, Al, and thank you all for joining. We have been honored to be a longtime partner of the foundation and had the opportunity to work with many national Baldrige recipients, including Midway USA, who we are really proud to be affiliated with. Friesen Nichols, another one that we just love that group. Mid-America Transplant, CORE. Charter School of San Diego, Alta Schools. We love all of you and really appreciate the partnership that we've had and the support you've all given us, and many other organizations as well, Pain Management Group, District 49, and other organizations that we work with as well, like International Paper, Team Health, Harvard Medical School, University of Chicago Medical University, South Carolina, just so many great organizations that we've been able to work with. And what we wanted to do today is share some of the best practices that we've heard and have kind of adopted with many of these organizations. We know your time's valuable, and so we have just a lot of content packed in here that we're going to dive into. And our hope is that by the end of this, that you'll know more about building great feedback programs, whether that's for your customers or patients or your employees or other stakeholders. We hope that you feel empowered to do something different maybe than what you've done before. And lastly, we hope that you'll go and make some of these improvements that you see here in your own programs and take some action on this feedback. So let's dive right in. So many organizations conduct a survey and frankly get nowhere, right? Our purpose here today is to really show you how to get somewhere and get somewhere on purpose. It's not enough to just run a survey. You really need to think about what we call the 3 M's. You want to measure the feedback that you're getting. You want to model that feedback in ways that make it actionable. And then you want to manage that feedback to drive change and performance improvements inside of your organization. You see the agenda on the screen here of the topics that we'll cover today. We're going to cover a wide variety of topics, starting with designing a survey program and what that looks like. Then we'll talk about what do you do with the results? How do I get those out into the organization and do something with them? We'll get into a really interesting space that I think you're going to love called linkage analytics. How do we start to link this data to other things and make it even more meaningful? And most importantly, we'll talk about action planning, taking action. Many organizations will go run a survey and sort of admire the data or find it interesting, but not take action. It's a big miss, and we want to really talk about that. Our name is Beyond Feedback for a reason. It's not about collecting the feedback, right? It's about doing something with it, making it actionable inside of your organization, driving change, driving performance excellence. That's what we're all about. And as Al said, at the end, we'll do some questions and wrap up with some next steps, actions that you can take. So many people think that designing a survey is kind of an easy task, right? I get a SurveyMonkey account, I write some questions down, and away we go. We want to introduce you a little bit more to the science behind the structure of survey programs and how do you design these in ways that are going to really deliver actionable insights and not just a bunch of interesting data that doesn't sort of get a lot of activity around it. So let's start by talking about what leading organizations do. When they're planning feedback surveys, they're really thinking about building tools across the entire life cycle of interactions. So many organizations will run a once-a-year customer survey or a once-a-year patient satisfaction survey or a once-a-year employee engagement survey, right? Those are certainly valuable, certainly helpful. We would not discourage you from doing those things. Please do those things. That's great. But what we know is that it's not enough to measure one point in time, your organization or your customer base or your employees. Different stakeholders are at different points of their life cycle with your organization. Whether you're talking about employees or customers or community members or donors, there's a life cycle of experiences that they go through with your organization, and you want to map out those experiences to understand what's going on in that particular facet of the relationship so that we can start to measure, model, and manage that, and measure, model, and manage the entire process all together. Here you see an example of an employee type of program, right, where we're doing employee surveys. So typically we think here of employee satisfaction and engagement. But as you can see here, there's so many more facets of that to think about. In really large tranches at the bottom of the screen here, you can think about onboarding experiences, engaging experiences, and transitioning experiences for employees. And to break those down in more detail, you might say there's an experience that happens with candidates as they apply for positions within our organization that's distinct and different from many of these other experiences, right? We want to understand that candidate experience. We want to understand what's happening with our new hires as they onboard in that first week. What was it like to be recruited by us? What was day one like? Did you have the tools and equipment? Did your supervisor greet you? There's so many things to unpack in that first couple of days of experience that are really setting a first impression for that employee. You want to touch back to that same employee maybe at about week 13, right? 3 months into the organization. Are they feeling productive? Do they feel like they fit? Do they feel like the team is sort of coalescing and those types of things? So digging into those types of areas. You have the engagement survey. Everyone's very familiar with that. Many of you have heard me talk before about a very unique engagement survey that we've built for the Baldrige community, and many national recipients use that survey. It was co-developed with Larry Potterfield and the Midway USA team, just an amazing group of people. 3 times they've been recipients of the Baldrige Award at a national level. It just blows you away when you think about what it takes to get there. But we've built a very unique tool there that is focused on the Baldrige criteria. And there's lots of other great tools out there, but engagement, certainly an important one. Pulse surveys, what's kind of going on, not just once a year or every other year, but kind of at interim stages in the experience of our employees. 360 reviews for managers, when you have leaders that can maybe understand a little bit more deeply, what are some of their strengths, what are some of the areas that they can work on and improve and focus on as a leader. And then you have a variety of different transitional surveys, department transition surveys. So when an employee leaves from one department and goes to another department, we want to understand what was their perspective about that previous department. What do they think about that new department now? They kind of have fresh eyes and they're looking at that as if they're a new hire almost within that department. What is their experience there? And then none of us want to have turnover, but we certainly want to learn from it, right? When an employee leaves the organization, they exit the organization, what are the dynamics there? What's going on? Why are they leaving really? Not just what they're telling their supervisor, but what's really going on underneath the surface there? How do we understand that and use a failure modes analysis to really dig deep into that and understand the dynamics? Now, as you look at all this, you can certainly understand and appreciate there are consistent themes across these different touch points, if you will, or different experiences. So in other words, we might find as an organization, hey, we need to communicate better in the candidate experience. And guess what? We need to communicate better in new hire onboarding, and we need to communicate better in engagement, and we need to communicate better in exit interviews. Gosh, maybe somebody's trying to tell us something, right? So looking at these not at a point in time, but looking at them across this life cycle gives you a new view to what are the dynamics going on? What are the consistent themes that we hear inside the organization that are really driving engagement, satisfaction, turnover, these outcomes that we ultimately want to see? On the flip side of that, we might find variances, right? We might find that there are some things going on that we're hearing from employees in the exit interview that are very, very different than what we hear in the new hire experience. And so maybe there's things that are really attracting and pulling people in, but we can't keep them and they end up leaving for these other reasons. So understanding these dynamics across the life cycle, really critically important to dig into. So here's a couple questions for your team. I want you to jot these down if you've got a pen and paper there with you. What critical insights are we missing because we're not measuring the full life cycle of an experience, whether that's our customers, our patients, our employees, some other stakeholder group? What are we missing today? And then the second question, how could we break those experiences of our employees or customers or stakeholders into a sequence of life cycle events like what you see on the screen here? So let's take this concept of survey structure a couple of steps further and drill into a specific type of survey that we might build, and one of those experiences we might build the survey around. The social science literature is really full of studies that have proven this concept, which is that behaviors are driven by a set of rational and emotional motivators that are driven by a set of experiences. Whether we're talking about customers or employees or patients or whatever it is, that formula is the same, right? And so when we build our surveys, what we want to do is we want to start with the end goal in mind. And so I want to draw your attention all the way to the right-hand side of this page here, where it says what we're ultimately trying to do, our ultimate outcome as an organization. We want to go fulfill our mission more. We want to deliver some kind of financial performance, right? There's some sort of an outcome that we want to drive to. Then we want to work backwards from that. And we want to say, okay, if our goal is some sort of financial performance, what are the customer behaviors that drive that goal? Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. So let's just say, very simple example, publicly traded company. The goal is profit maximization, right? Shareholder value, those kinds of things. There are a few customer behaviors, things that customers actually do that drive that, right? They repurchase, they renew contracts, they make referrals, they make repeat purchases, they buy new products. Those are behaviors. We want to understand what those behaviors are, because we're going to use those in a moment to build a survey out, right? That ultimately we can connect the behavior to the outcome that we want to get to. Going a little bit further to the left on this model, then in the red box there, we would use those customer behaviors to say, okay, what are the experiences that ultimately yield those behaviors? And then you can see the other elements of this. The same thing happens over on the employee side, right? There's a set of employee behaviors we want to drive. What are the experiences that ultimately drive those behaviors, that drive our operational excellence, that drive customer experiences, that drive customer behavior, that drive our outcomes? So this entire model here is really a series of inputs and outputs, if you think of it that way. And certainly something that you all can map out within your own organization as well. As we just take this a step further and kind of let's talk and unpack that left-hand side around the employee experience. So what are the key requirements that directly or indirectly drive the behavior or engagement level of your employees? So let's think about employee engagement and behaviors that we want to drive with employees. Some examples: retention, right? We want people to stay. So we might have a question there about how likely would you be to stay with the organization. Advocacy, we want our employees to go out and be ambassadors to the rest of the world of all the good things that we do as an organization, recruit more people, help build great relationships with customers, et cetera. So we might have a question there about how likely would you be to recommend our company to a friend or family member, right? How proud are you to work here? Those are advocacy kinds of questions. Expansion, we ultimately want our employees to grow and expand inside the organization. Would they promote into other roles? Would they take on new projects? Would they identify process improvements? Those are behaviors that ultimately drive the outcomes we want. Compliance types of behaviors, right? Would they be willing to adopt some new policy that we have around work from home or return to work or whatever that policy is? They're all great questions to kind of measure behavioral intent so that we can understand how we connect it to actual results. Now, if we work backwards from those behaviors, we can talk about experiences that employees have. They have experiences with the job itself, right? Training, workload, career development opportunities, those kinds of things. They have experiences with their team and their supervisor. Is my supervisor effective at communicating? Are they recognizing us for good performance, et cetera? They have experiences certainly with their compensation and benefits. That's been a big topic over the last couple of years in engagement surveys in particular, with inflation rates, the level that they're at. Seeing just some frustration there that many employees have. And then they have experiences with the organization overall. So those experiences, what they read, see, hear, experience themselves in those different areas ultimately drive their behavior that ultimately drive the rest of this model. And as we take it a step further, you can see on the right-hand side with customers, a very similar pattern here, right? There are behaviors we're trying to drive with customers. I mentioned a few of them earlier: retention, repurchasing, renewing contracts, advocacy, likely to recommend, serving as a reference, expansion opportunities, buying new products, compliance, right? So you'll notice that those behaviors are not different between employees and customers. They're the same basic broad categories: retention, advocacy, expansion, compliance. We might frame them up a little bit differently depending on which audience we're talking about, but the same concepts. And then we know that those behaviors are ultimately driven by a set of experiences that they have, right? What do they think about the sales representative? Are they responsive? Are they knowledgeable? What do they think about customer service wait time and ability to resolve problems and the knowledge of them, pricing, billing, product and service attributes? You can think of all the different touch points that your customers have that ultimately drive those behaviors. So ask yourself and your team this question. Are we building feedback tools that are measuring the right factors that ultimately impact our business or our organization or our mission delivery? Do we have the right factors? Have we thought about those things? How do we build that out into our survey? Now let's get really practical. This is where everyone thinks about surveys as what we would label questionnaire design, right? How do I really build good survey questions? How do I really build a good questionnaire? On the left side of the screen here, you can see what we call the 6 key principles of great survey design, actionable survey design. I'll talk about each of them. I could spend an entire day on each of these topics. These are huge, huge topics, but relevance, we need to make sure that it's relevant both to our audience and business relevant to us as an organization. Objectivity, we need to make sure we're not leading our respondents in some way, that it's an objective measure that we can use. Question structure, we want those questions to be structured, framed in a similar fashion, in the same way, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. We want our rating scales to be consistent, just important things around question structure. Look and feel, we want a really clean, nice, organized, easy to read, easy to use instrument, right? We've seen so many that are just a big conglomeration of random questions all over the place, and it's just hard to look at as a respondent. Flow, we want to think about the flow of the questions. What do we start with first? Where do we go next? What are the questions we should end on? There is a lot of science behind this and really important that you get this flow right. And I'll give you a quick little hint here. Start with the questions that are closest to the respondent and then go further away from the respondent, right? So in my example earlier around employees, we talked about job, that's really close to me, right? The job I do. My team is a step further. My supervisor, right? My team and supervisor kind of a step further. The organization kind of a step further away. So when I think about the flow of that survey, I want to go from closest to the respondent to furthest away from the respondent. It helps them organize that psychologically in their mind. And then clarity, we want to make sure that the questions are clear, that when we ask the question, they understand what it is that we're asking. That might be about how we adapt education level in terms of questions. It might also be about how we make those questions crisp, clean, clear, and really simple to understand. You know, again, I could spend so much time on this topic. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give you kind of the Cliff Notes version. We all remember those back from school. I'll give you what we might call George's top 10 list of top priorities. Those of you that are Dave Letterman fans from way back in the day. Here's number 10, keep the survey short. 7 to 10 minutes if you're trying to complete it online is what you want to do. We want to avoid what we call survey fatigue. So keep it short. That's been a big trend. The day of 30-minute, 45-minute, 100 question surveys, it's gone. The attention span is just not there. You're going to lose your audience. Keep it short. And by the way, when I say keep it short, if you're thinking about text-based surveys, even shorter still, 3 to 5 minutes, very, very short. We want to keep it clean, simple, and organized. I mentioned this earlier. Consistency in the look and feel from page to page, consistency in the layout, the colors that are used, fonts that are used. Hey, here's a couple of real simple things. Don't misspell things. Don't get grammar wrong, right? Those little things, as simple as they sound. Have somebody else read the survey first for you after you built it to really get a fresh set of eyes on that. It's so easy to make those simple mistakes. Frame your questions in a personal way, meaning make them I questions, I, me, my questions, right? You want to touch the heart of that respondent and get them to think in their own terms, not abstractly, not in some, speculative way, but what do they think and feel about this topic? Because remember, the way they think and feel, what they've heard, read, experienced, seen, feel about that topic drives their behavior. That's what we're trying to get to, right? We ultimately want to understand what are those key drivers, because all those things aggregated together in an organization of 10,000 people, let's say, start to drive a lot of behavioral momentum in a direction inside the organization that can either be positive or negative. Frame those questions personally. That'll help a lot. Keep your questions me-see. I love this term. We borrowed this from the McKinsey group, just an amazing group of consultants. The concept of MISI, many of you have probably heard it before. It's an acronym that stands for mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. So when we're thinking about questions, we want our questions to be mutually exclusive. We don't need to ask the same question 3 different ways. That's not helpful. But we want them to be collectively exhaustive. So if I think about a supervisor in our example earlier of an employee, I want to make sure that the questions that I am measuring are collectively exhaustive of the experience that they might have with their supervisor, right? Did I touch all the different facets of what it's like to interact with their supervisor? Communication, feedback, performance reviews, accessibility and availability, right? Think of all those different facets, be MISI in how you build those questions out. Really important one here, we call this, and this is a little bit of a heady topic, but we call this concept abstraction. You want to use consistent concept abstraction. What do I mean by that? What is concept abstraction? Let's break it down. Let's talk again in the example of an employee. If I ask a question about benefits, what's your satisfaction with overall benefits? That's a very high level of abstraction, right? If I talk about what do you think about the premium on our health insurance plan, that's a very different, more detailed level of abstraction. What I don't want to do is mix my level of abstractions in my question. So I ask an overall question about overall benefits, very, very broad level of abstraction. Now I ask this very, very micro detailed question about the premium on health insurance. It's just confusing to people, right? It actually kind of melts their brain a little bit to try to jump from those different levels. So as you're building your surveys out, think about consistent level of abstraction in your questions. Keep your rating scales consistent. Please, please, please do your respondents a favor. Don't switch rating scales every question. Don't switch rating scales every page. Figure out a rating scale that will work for all your questions and stick with it. One of the best ones out there, really simple if you're into 5-point Likert scales, is what we call a level of agreement scale. I strongly agree, I somewhat agree, I neither agree nor disagree, I somewhat disagree, I strongly disagree, and give them an NA option too. I probably will talk about that in my top 10 in a minute here. But very simple, very consistent all the way through the survey. Boy, we've seen lots of things here in terms of survey scales that you know are not best practices. So use a consistent rating scale. It'll help you. It'll help your respondents. Keep that rating scale balanced. You heard the example I gave of we have a strongly agree, a somewhat agree. We have kind of this neutral response. Then we have a somewhat disagree and a strongly disagree, right? It's balanced. We got 2 positive types of response. We got 2 negative types of response. We got 1 in the middle. That's balanced. What have we seen that's kind of like not balanced? I'll give you a quick example. I'm not familiar at all. I'm slightly familiar. I'm somewhat familiar. I'm moderately familiar. I'm extremely familiar. That's a horrible scale. What anyone on the chat, please tell me what's the difference between slightly familiar, somewhat familiar, and moderately familiar? Don't know. Neither do your respondents, right? Make those rating scales balanced. Keep them very clean, distinct levels between those different response levels so that it's very clear to your respondents what you are asking. I mentioned this, allow neutral and NA responses. Lots of people like to get rid of the neutral and say, well, we just want to know if they're positive or negative. Neutral tells you something. When people are neutral, remember, let's go back to what we just talked about. When people are neutral, it means they have not experienced enough yet, or they don't know enough, they haven't heard enough about that topic to have formed an opinion. It is almost always an indicator that your organization needs to communicate more on that topic, or get more of your customers or more of your employees exposed to that topic, right? So don't get rid of your neutrals. Keep them there. They're actually giving you a lot of actionable insight. Don't discard them, and give them an NA option. That's a really important one. There are some questions that people just can't answer for some reason. They just don't know. They haven't been with the organization long enough. They haven't, if they're a customer, they maybe don't feel comfortable answering a question in some way. Don't force them to, just give them an NA option. We're good then, because what you don't want to have happen is rather than having an NA option, they randomly assign some score to it, right? Oh, I somewhat agree, I guess. Well, now you got false data there that's not really telling you the truth. Give them an NA option, give them a way out. By the way, pro tip here, only about 1 to 2% of people will ever pick the NA option. It's not like you're losing data there. But you're giving them the opportunity to bow out when they don't want to answer. Avoid questions you already know. This is a big one. If you already know the answer to the question, don't ask. You already know it. And I'll give you some examples. Sometimes in a customer survey, for example, at the end of a customer survey, someone will say, well, we want to put these demographic questions in here about how much this customer, how often they visit our hospital. You have data on that. Use that data, right? Just build all that into your database so that when you get that patient's response in, you already know how often they visited. You have records that tell you that. So don't ask a patient to try to draw on their memory or come up with something that you already know the answer to. Link your other data sets to make sense of that on your own. Last one of my top 10 list, probably a pet peeve of ours. Don't require responses. I know sometimes, and let me draw a caveat over that. Don't require responses unless it's absolutely necessary. Many organizations will say, well, we want all those questions required. Well, here's the problem with that. Let's say that we're reaching out to a patient and for some reason they don't want to answer that question. And it's an online survey, let's say, right? They're doing it on their desktop computer. When they get to a question that's going to require a response and they don't want to respond or can't respond for some reason, I can tell you what they're going to do. They're going to find their way up to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and there's a little X up there that they're really skilled at clicking on. And they will click on that, and guess what? Now you lost all that information. You got no data from them because they didn't respond to this one thing that you were requiring, right? Again, the non-response rate in surveys is very, very low. We're talking single-digit percentages, low single-digit percentages, 1 to 3%. You're not losing a lot of data because you're not requiring responses. People will respond. Keep it short, but they will respond if you do all the other right things. So we've conducted a survey. We've got some results in. Now what do we do with it? Many organizations will run a survey and they'll just leave it with a small group of executives to kind of consume and figure out what to do with it. This couldn't be further from the best practice. The organizations that we work with that are really great at this, I mentioned some of them earlier, Midway USA, Harvard Medical School, so many others, International Paper, they use this data. They figure out, how do we make this useful? How do we get this into the organization in ways that it can be used and consumed by lots of different entities within the organization? That's not just an employee survey. Well, that's a customer survey, an employee survey, whatever it is. You need to be thinking about, how do we deploy those results to the entire organization? That's how you get what they call in the military a force multiplier to really see some impact around that data and really see some change happen. When you think about this deployment, there are 3 general audiences that we'll talk about, and certainly we could segment these even more when you think about rolling these results out to teams within your organization. But each of these different audiences have very different needs. What's common to them is that all of them need the data in an easy to use format for them, and it needs to be thoughtfully cascaded down through the organization. So let's start in the upper left-hand corner there with executive leaders. We want for them an executive summary of top OFIs, top opportunities for improvement, top strengths, very quick, cut to the chase. I've seen some people do this with 50-page presentations, 100-page presentations, 200-page presentations. You have nauseated your executive leaders. They've lost interest. 10 pages. Get yourself to 10 pages. That's your goal. You probably already know this, but it is way, 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 way harder to get down to a succinct, impactful, actionable 10 pages than it is to create 200 pages. 200 pages is easy. 10 pages, really, really, really hard. One of our client CEOs gave us a really nice compliment. He heads up a research institute in Texas, very strong academic background, had been with USC and University of Iowa, some other Ohio State, I think at one point as well. He said, one of the things that you all really do really well, you really synthesize this into these insights together and help us draw conclusions from it. It's not a data dump. It's thoughtful. It identifies business problems we need to solve. That's what I would encourage you to do, right? With that executive team, get that data culled down. What do they really need to know? I know you want to share all the other fantastic details of it, but there's some things that you really need to share with them. Get to that core crux of what are the 1 or 2 things that we want them to walk away with. When we think about executive leaders, another thing that's going to be really important to them, benchmarking to external elements, right? So the industry externally, maybe benchmarking to national Malcolm Baldrige recipients, But think there in terms of external benchmarks, right? That's going to be important to them. How are we performing as an organization relative to our industry, relative to our peers, et cetera? Your next large audience is what we'll broadly call managers. So these are going to be leaders within your organization. They are somewhat interested in the total company scores or total organizational scores. What they're really interested in is their team, right? And so let's get that data to them as quickly as possible in a very easy to consume format. They want to understand what are their team specific scores? What are some comment themes that we hear from their team specifically? We want to get all that data to them in a way that they can use it. We recommend things like interactive dashboards. You see that on the screen there in the upper right-hand corner. There's something that they can kind of interact with, especially if they're a leader of leaders. Let's say that they're a chief nursing officer, a VP of nursing or something like that. They want to be able to drill down into the different units within their team and kind of see what are the dynamics going on. Give them those capabilities to drill down into that data. Give them data that compares them to other leaders within their organization from a benchmarking perspective. That's really important. For the average typical manager inside of an organization, I'm painting with a broad brush. Certainly there's more nuance than this, and certainly that's something that you need to think through. But generally speaking, leaders are not as interested in the external world. In fact, we often will hear from them, well, that's a different company, that's a different organization, that's a different hospital. That's not us. We're different. We have a different culture here. We have these constraints and these dynamics and blah, 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 blah. They're not wrong. They're also not completely right, but they're not wrong. So what do you do? How do you deal with that? How do you help that? Give them data that gives them comparisons of their team to other leaders within the same organization. So here's how your team's scoring. Here's how the rest of the organization's doing, right? Now I can't make excuses as a manager that, well, that's Disney or that's, Google or some other organization that I can't connect with. No. These are other leaders within your same organization got this score and you got that score. Let's talk about why and what are the dynamics and what are the differences, because you all are operating in the same system, right? Now, to take that benchmarking a step further, what we would recommend is not only give them some scores within the organization. Again, this could be patient scores, customer scores, employee scores, you name it. But give them some quartile data within the organization, right? These are our top quartile customer teams and how they score on all these questions. These are our bottom quartile customer teams and how they score. These are our top performing patient satisfaction teams and what their scores are. These are our bottom quartile patient satisfaction teams. So it gives them not only a comparison of what's the norm or average inside the organization, but what's great performance. How do I get to that level? Give me something to kind of aspire to, or maybe I'm already there with my team, right? But help them really understand where they sit within the organization, within the context of their world. The third group, and a really important one, whether we're talking about customer surveys, employee surveys, stakeholder surveys of some sort, get that data all the way out to your employees. All employees want to know what's going on with this data. So how do you do that? Here's what we'd recommend. Give them a high-level view of the total organization. You can see a slide up there on the page. It gives you sort of an illustration of that. What's going well? Here's the top 3 things that are going well. What can be better? Here's the top 3 things that could be better, right? And what are we doing next? Really, really simple, right? But really helps every employee to kind of connect with, here's the broad themes that we heard in the organization, whether those are customer themes or employee themes or whatever they may be. And then make sure that employees and staff get an opportunity to see detailed team scores. Similar to what we share with managers, you'd want to share that as a manager leader with your team and have a conversation with them about some of those scores. Now, don't do that in an accusatory way. Why did you score this that way? Do that in a, we're all in this boat together, how do we get better kind of way when you think about those scores and how to do that. Let me pause for just a moment and say a really important thing. The worst thing that you can do, the worst thing on the employee survey side in particular, the worst thing you can do with employees is go conduct a survey and then not share the results in any way. One thing that will certainly happen is your scores will go down the next time that you do that survey. So avoid that trap. Make sure that you share the results, even if it's at a very high level. It helps them connect. They invested their time and energy and effort and sometimes risked some opinions that they have to share that feedback with the leadership team, honor that, right? Honor that by telling them, here's what we heard and here's what we're going to do about it. It really drives engagement. Ask yourself and your team this question. Do we have a structured deployment plan in place that gets survey results all the way from the executive leaders all the way to frontline staff in a systematic way? Ask your team that question. Let's talk next about a really interesting area that we call linkage analytics. What do we mean by that? What is this linkage analytics? It's the process of taking survey data and connecting it to a couple different things. One, either other survey data, that can be insightful and interesting. Two, internal operational data, or three, some kind of financial data. It's a really important step in your journey. These other data points are how your organization really operates on a day-to-day basis, right? There are metrics that are built into scorecards that are driving behavior inside of your organization. To give more validity and more strength to your survey feedback that you have, connect with those things. Don't try to fight against them. Become part of that by linking them together and showing the organization that this is how these things are connected. Now you're having a very different conversation. It's not just about opinions and attitudes. It's about how this survey data is connected to real business, quote unquote, right? That's going on. So let's talk about how you can do this. And we're going to give you some examples here that can go from very basic to very advanced. And today we'll share kind of a basic and an intermediate example. So you all by now probably recognize that little visual up at the top. Employee experiences drive engagement, which drive operational excellence, which drive customer experiences, which drive customer behaviors that drive financial performance, right? So let's say that we've completed an employee survey and we want to explain the importance of this survey to our executive leaders in financial terms, right? You might say, okay, George, how do I do that? Like that sounds good. I don't understand how I'm going to get there. There are lots of ways to do this, but I'm going to give you a really simple example here. Let's start off with a question that's very familiar, comes up pretty often in an employee survey. How likely are you to stay if you were offered a similar position elsewhere? Okay, so we get that data back in. 66% of our staff agree with that. They're positive on that. They really strongly agree or somewhat agree. 20% were somewhat disagree or strongly disagree. And for those math experts out there that are doing quick math, about 14% are neutral. We're not talking about the neutrals here. We're just talking about the agrees and the disagrees. So we have some data now that says, okay, 66% say yes, 20% say no. They don't plan to stay with the organization. We can now use that data to tie to some financial insights, right? We know that there are costs associated with employee turnover. There are separation costs. There are replacement costs. There's training time and materials. There's lost productivity. So what we want to do is take that 20.3% and translate that into actual staff counts, and then calculate the associated turnover costs with that, right? So we can get to a financial value at stake. And you can see the quick math done here. We now know 20.3%. That translates to 68 staff members that are going to leave in the next 2 years, right? We know that they're going to leave. They've already told us they're not likely to stay if they're offered another position in the next 2 years. We know that the average salary inside the organization, let's say, is $45,000 a year. So we can do some math and figure out, what are those costs? The predicted annual turnover costs now are $655,000. If we include lost productivity into that, it's $1.35 million. Wow, like we're having a very different conversation than, hey, 66% say yes and 20% say no. We're having a financial conversation now about what's really at stake here if we don't address this challenge. How do we get this better? Because if we don't, it's going to cost us, right? And we want to understand that. This example is certainly a fairly small organization, as you can see, just use kind of a quick salary basis there. If you want to know more about this, email me. We have an online calculator that can help you calculate turnover costs for your organization and help you learn more about this. So ask yourself and your team this question. You might want to jot this one down. For the next survey we run, how do we connect the results to some kind of financial outcome, financial value at stake, you might call it? Let's go to a little bit more intermediate example of linkage analytics. We're going to use a healthcare example here. And what we're going to do is link together patient satisfaction scores and staffing levels, right? And come up with some new insights. We kind of mash those together and see what we did. So how do we do this? We took data from individual facility patient satisfaction scores, During the same timeframes, at those same facilities, we also collected a bunch of data around staffing levels at those same timeframes that we got the patient satisfaction data, right? That's really important. And there's a couple really important things there. One is the unit of analysis is the facility. The second is the time frame is consistent in both of these measures. When we get that, we can understand that better and link these things together. Once we have all that data together, we can start to aggregate it back together, right? We have, let's say that we have an organization, a healthcare organization that has 57 different facilities. We re-aggregate all that data now across 57 different facilities, and you can start to build a model that looks something like this, that helps you to understand how do we optimize our HCAHPS, patient SAT scores, and understand at what staffing levels do they start to really fall off, right? And you can see it very visually there, really simply in that chart to understand when we fall below a certain threshold of staffing, that's having a big impact on our patient SAT scores, which is connected to HCAHPS, which is connected to financials, and you get the picture of where I'm going with all that. So ask yourself and your team this question: what internal operational metrics can we link to survey data to create new and actionable insights? And I know I gave you a quick example here. I've got some steps on the right-hand side of the screen there that will give you some tips of how do I actually do that? It sounds really good. I want to do it. How do I do it? There's some tips in here. Download the replay of this and you can look at those in some more detail. And again, reach out to us. We're glad to help and give you some thoughts and advice around that. Last topic, and probably the most important, action planning. Many organizations will create a great survey. They might talk with their teams about the results, but they fail to really put a meaningful and targeted action plan in place. And it's not just enough to have an action plan. If you do something and you don't tell anyone about it, customers, employees, they're not going to attribute that change in their experience to any kind of improvement that you made or the feedback that they gave or anything, right? So you've got to communicate. Let's dig into this topic. When talking with leaders about building action plans, because remember your audiences, right? There's going to be a big audience of leaders inside the organization, leaders, managers, however you want to label them. When talking with them in these organizations that we work with that really do the best of the best, there is a to-do list that they follow and a to-don't list, if you will, a to-not-do list. So let's look at some of the items here on the to-not-do list. Don't do this if you're a leader or a manager. Don't use that data to validate pre-existing opinions that you have or strategies. Oh, I knew that's what it was going to say. That's great. There's probably going to be stuff in there that you know already, but don't try to shape the data in some way to kind of fit your preconceived notion. Like, look at it as an objective outside viewer and see, what is this data really telling me? Don't use phrases that disempower you as a leadership team. And I'll tell you the one that we hate the most is, well, our people or our staff just won't blah, right? Our team just won't do whatever. Who's the leader, right? You don't go to that place. You've just disempowered yourself. You're saying we're powerless to do anything about it. We can't really fix it. Those kinds of, gosh, that's just a bad sort of mental state to be in, right? So change your mindset. Ask yourself questions like, how do we lead our teams to do this differently? How do we lead the organization in this direction, rather than disempowering yourself and coming up with a million excuses? Because you will, naturally, you'll do it. Even those of us that have been doing this a long time, do it. Force yourself, right? It's not about our team not doing the right things or something. We haven't led them there. And so get that phrase of our team members just won't or our staff won't. Get that out of your vernacular. Don't get defensive about the feedback. You will certainly hear some things that you love. You will certainly hear some things that you do not love, for lack of a better phrase. Don't get defensive about it. Don't try to defend. Don't try to rationalize. Don't try to obfuscate. Just deal with it. It is the perspective of your customers at a certain point in time. It is a perspective of your patients at a certain point in time. It is their reality. Whether you like it or not, you can try to defend it 18 ways to Sunday, but guess what? The more you defend, you will never act on a problem that you won't acknowledge as a problem, right? The more you try to defend that, you're not going to do anything about it. Don't get defensive about the feedback. Try to identify who said what in the comments. This is to not do. Do not do this. This is the recipe for disaster as a manager or leader, going around to your team and going, I know you said this, or reading their comments verbatim back to them. don't do it. It does nothing but breaks trust in about a split second. You spent years and years and years building trust with your team and with your organization, and you can wipe it out in a flash doing something like this. So don't worry about who said what. Look for themes in those comments, right? No matter who said it, there's probably, and I would also say, like, don't isolate one comment and build a whole strategy around that. That's a bad idea. Somebody had a bad day, wrote a comment, not useful. Look at the themes. What are you consistently hearing inside your organization or from your customers or from your patients? What are those themes that you hear all the time? Whether they say it different ways or whether they said it a little more edgy than another one, it's a theme, right? And how do we attack that theme and address that systemic issue? I mentioned this just a moment ago. Don't develop a strategy around one comment. There are some comments that will sometimes be very sensational, very interesting. You'll love to read them, or maybe not love to read them, but don't build a strategy around them. It's one comment, it's one person's opinion. Look for themes. What are the consistent themes that we're hearing from customers or from employees? How do we address those? Last one on the to don't list, don't let the criticism go to your heart and don't let the praise go to your head, right? Really simple concept, but you're gonna hear some great, very glowing things in a survey like this. Don't let that go to your head. You're a steward there to, and again, it's people's opinion at a point of time, and anyone that's managed people for more than a day knows that that opinion will change really quickly, and it'll change back again, and it'll change again. Don't get invested in it, right? It's great to hear that kind of positive feedback, tuck it away and make yourself feel good for a minute, but don't let it go to your head. And don't let the criticism go to your heart. Sometimes the most critical people in your organization are the ones that love the most the organization, right? They really care. They are really invested. That's why they're being critical. They want to see this fixed. They want to help in some way. They don't know how. Don't let it go to your heart. They're just trying to give you feedback, right? It's a gift. What you do with that gift is up to you. And use it wisely. Let's talk about what to do. We said what not to do. Identify one or two actions that you can improve. Many organizations will go, oh, there's 50 things in here we want to fix. You're not going to fix 50 things. You're not going to fix 10 things. One or two. That's all that we're talking about. You've already got a business that you're running or an organization that you're running or a mission that you're trying to drive towards. There's all kinds of things in that work stream already. You might be able to fit one or two real action items in there and make a difference there, right? If you scattershot your effort across 10 different things, it'll feel like nothing inside the organization. Focus, focus, focus. Get to the root cause of issues and opportunities. I know many of you are familiar with tools that can help you in this area, Chicago diagrams and root cause analysis and 5 whys and all kinds of tools like that. Use those. Very, very valuable. You're going to get a theme. What's the root cause of that theme? Let's dig deep and try to understand what's really happening there. Set a time frame for completion and milestones for progress. So this is what you want to do, right? If you just say, hey, we're going to communicate better, by when and how and what does that look like? You got to get detailed here. What does communicate better mean? What does I'm going to meet with my team more mean? Put a time frame in there. Give yourself a deadline. It's got to happen by here. And here's how I know I'm making progress towards that, right? Make sure that you do that as a leader. Plan your actions comprehensively. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute here, but it's not enough to just come up with an action plan. There's a whole set of things that need to surround that to be effective. This one, the last one on the list, but gosh, the most important, you cannot communicate enough. That's why I wrote it 3 times. Write this down. If I'm building an action plan, if I'm trying to do something with data, I'm going to have to communicate. After I think I've communicated enough times, keep communicating it. After people are repeating it back to me because they're so sick of hearing it, keep communicating it. Don't stop communicating that message. There are people inside your organization that have not heard it, or it didn't resonate with them at the time, or they couldn't connect it to their own business. Keep communicating that same message. It's so, so critical. If you want to see some change, you want to see some results, communication, one of your top tools in the bag. All right, let's talk a little bit here. The best practice around action planning. We want to get those results down to like 1 or 2 actions, right? So how do we do that? A couple of real simple templates here. On the left-hand side, you'll see what we would call kind of a brainstorming template. So if I'm a leader inside the organization, whether I'm an executive leader and I'm talking about my executive team, or I'm a frontline supervisor and I'm talking about the 13 call center employees that work for me, let's build out a meeting and go through some of the data, right? What is the data saying? And as you go through it, do this in a very non-judgmental, non-defensive way. What are the facts that we're hearing from the survey? No speculation, no conjecture, just what are the facts that we hear? Okay, we hear that our patients say that we're not getting to them quickly enough. That's a fact. Whether we like it or not, or how we want to dismiss it is a different issue. The fact is that's what patients think, right? We hear this from our employees. We hear from our employees that they're not getting enough feedback about how they're doing on a project. It's a fact. I can give you all kinds of reasons why they feel that way, but it doesn't matter. That's a fact, right? So just focus on the facts. Don't shoot down ideas here. Don't judge them. Just here's the facts that we hear, and then start to think through what could we do to improve the results of that. We have a fact here. It's a perceptual fact, right? It's a perception, but it's a fact nonetheless. What could we do to improve that? And recognize what I just said there. Sometimes what we can do about it is change the perception, right? It's not always an intervention we have to put in place. Sometimes it's about how we frame something for the organization or how we communicate something. It's how we shape those perceptions. But the data is really good and really useful. Don't dismiss it just because it's a perception. Change the perception. Lead them, right? Don't just don't feel disempowered. Once you've identified some things that you think you might be able to do, get really serious about building out an action plan. You see an example of that on the right-hand side of the screen here. You'll notice there's not 50 items on there. Action number 1, number 2, number 3. If you go to number 3, you probably went too far. Number 1, number 2, stop there, right? And plan these out thoroughly. What's a description of the action you're going to take? Who's going to lead this on our team? What specific things are we doing now? The next 30 days, what are we doing, right? What support do we need from other teams inside the organization in order to accomplish this? What's this going to look like 6 months from now? How are we going to measure this? How do we define success in some way? You've got to answer those questions. You got to answer them at a detailed level or it's not going to work. Really, really important there. Take those few precious ideas, build them out. Ask yourself and your team this question: what tools have we given leaders to enable them to drive action planning within their teams? Have we given them tools? How do we do that? Many of you have likely seen this chart before. It really speaks to the need to embed those improvements into the DNA of how your teams operate or how your organization operates. If we create a vision, and we train our teams to have the skills they need, and we give them the incentives, those are financial and non-financial, by the way, to achieve it. We make sure that they have the tools that they need and the resources they need. We have a clear plan of action. We're going to see change, right? That's the happy path there. If we're missing any of those elements, we will end up sub-optimizing our outcomes, right? No vision, we create confusion. No skills, we have lots of vision, no skills, we create anxiety for people, right? We have vision, we have skills, no incentives, we create resistance, people push back. We have vision, we have skills, we have incentives, we have no resources, we create frustration for the team. We have all these other things and we have no action plan. We have what you might call fits and starts, false starts, right? We kind of get going and we don't really know where to go next, and so it kind of dies off. So look at that comprehensively when you're building your action plans. Make sure that you're really thinking through all of these elements. So what do you do next? We're coming up at the end of our time here. Number one, I would say form a team. Get a team together within your organization. Talk about these concepts. Figure out how you can adopt some of these concepts and principles within your organization. I've talked through them here today. They're not that complicated. They take some effort and they take some work and they'll take a team. But get that group together. Second, there's a lot of support and resources available in the Baldrige community. Get some expertise from your local Baldrige program. They are just filled with other organizations that have been down these paths. They're filled with experts that can really help you tap into how to do some of these things. The Institute for Performance Excellence, a great online resource. There's so much material inside of that resource that you can use to help understand how to do some of these things better. And I'll tell you a really great source as well, if you've maybe new to the Baldrige community, past recipients, whether they're at the state or local or national level, they love sharing their best practices, and they will be very glad to share those with you. So reach out to some of those. You can go online to the the Baldrige website, you can actually see their past applications and and kind of dig into those and understand how they talk through things and how they work through things. Lots of valuable resources there from the Baldrige community. Would really encourage you to tap into those. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, go beyond feedback. We're glad to talk with you anytime. If there's not a project involved, that's okay. We just love to share. As you can maybe tell, we're a little bit passionate about this topic, and we'd love to share with you and your team, ideas. If you just want some advice or a quick consult on something, I've got my email address there. Reach out. We're glad to help anytime. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Al and maybe open it up here for some questions.
George, as always, thanks for such a dynamic and interesting presentation, which has driven a number of questions here. So I'm going to get right to them so that we can get as many in as possible. So the first one is, how often should an organization be surveying their customers or employees? And is there a best practice in terms of survey frequency that will avoid the dreaded survey fatigue?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So if we're talking about customers or employees, I'll give you the quick answer, and then I'll give you kind of the little bit more thoughtful answer. Typically about once a year for like a big employee engagement survey or a big customer satisfaction survey, that's probably about right. Right now, why do I come to that conclusion? Let me explain exactly why that's right, and why, or why it's not right for every organization, but why I kind of generalized and made it right. If you're going to run a survey, there's a couple things that you need to do, right? We talked about some of them here. You're going to run the survey. You're going to get the results. That's going to take some time, right, to get those results in. You're going to need to digest those results, deploy them into the organization, down into all the different levels of the organization. You're going to need to build action plans around that. Those action plans have to actually take some traction and take place and get implemented. And then let's say it's customers. Those customers or patients need to actually experience something different next time they come, right? If you think through that cycle, getting the results, absorbing the data, maybe that's kind of 30, 60, 90 days, something like that. Building out action plans, that kind of thing, maybe another 30, 60 days. Actually kind of implementing some of that might take another 30, 60, 90 days. People experiencing it enough times that they don't think it's an accident when it was right the next time, that might take another 90 days, right? So you add all that up, you end up kind of right in that sphere of about a year. And what I'll tell you is there are some amazing organizations out there. I keep touting my good friends at Midway USA, but they're amazing at this action planning step and do it just really, really well. And they've figured over time how to do that on really short cycles and really short intervals, and they're really quick at it. And so they can get that down to maybe even 6 months, that entire cycle of improvement that I just described there. So think about that inside your organization. How quick, how adept are we at change? How quickly can we work through that cycle? That's really the right answer. It might be a year, it might be 6 months. You might be able to do it quarterly if you're really agile. But you need to think through all those steps and make sure that you've really done all those things, because again, the thing you don't want to do is survey, no change, survey again, scores go down.
George, one more question we've got time for real quick here. Some organizations tie surveys to compensation and bonus structures. What are the pros and cons of that approach?
Yeah, that's a fun one. I think we've probably all been to the car dealer that is telling you, you got to give me a 10, you got to give me 10, you got to give me 10. Why do they do that? It's because they've kind of immaturely tied compensation, variable compensation, in this case of the car dealer, their sales commission maybe, to a net promoter score, likely to recommend kind of score. So that by the way is not all a bad thing. I know some organizations that can do that really, really well. But here's what you got to think about is the maturity of those metrics, right? So we talked about doing this survey regularly. If we're mature as an organization, we've been doing this for a long time. We know how to move the needle on those survey metrics. We know how to connect them to operational data. We know how to connect them to financials. We know how to action plan around them. You're pretty mature. Guess what? You can probably, the next step of that evolution is to start to tie to compensation, right? When you've got that level of maturity. If you just go launch a survey and you say, let's say to all your salespeople, or let's say it's an employee survey, and you're going to tell all your managers, hey, we're going to tie, a percentage of your bonus to what your employee scores are. 1,000 bad behaviors will come out of your managers, things you haven't even thought of before, you didn't think were possible. They will invent new ways to game that system to maximize the financial gain that they have. So make sure, I think the pros and cons there's a lot of them, but I think make sure that you're thinking about what I would label sort of the maturity of the organization with this kind of data. If we're really mature, let's tie it to comp. That's kind of the next level of taking that maturity up another notch. if we're just getting new at this and we're just getting started, pump the brakes a little bit. You may have read something online, but it's really not a great practice until you know what you're doing to start tying things to compensation.
Okay, well, George, once again, thanks for such a dynamic presentation and a lot of great information there. Just super stuff. I mean, and for all those people who had questions, if George did not get to your question here today, he will answer you via email. As a reminder, real quick on this slide, I just want to point out that the Institute for Performance Excellence has over 400 self-paced online courses available, many of them certification courses, and many of them with leadership, workforce, and customer focus, covering a lot of the topics that George discussed here today. And lastly, I want to thank all of our sponsors once again. Thank you so much for all of your support, especially the members of the Mac Baldrige Society, whose generous support make programs like today's available to the Baldrige community. As a reminder, again, all of the slides and this presentation, a copy of it, will be available next week on the Institute's website at baldrigefoundation.org. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day.